Okay. When and where were you born? I'm going to ask you some different questions that are probably already recorded, but I'll let you tell us about them.
Okay. I was born in the little town of Brownsburg, Virginia, in a home that was owned at that time by a lady named Mamie Morris. She, I guess, became heir to that home through her husband, and he had been dead for some time. But she had become a Christian, was called to the ministry and to establish a church, and my father and mother were asked to come up and work with her. She had this, to me at that time, a beautiful big brick home, and it was big, but not nearly as big as I recall it. So each one of her rooms were named, and I was born as you enter the front porch, the front door from the wraparound porch. Our room was the first one to the left, and it was called the Morris Room. So it is now a historic, on the historic registry of the United States and of the state of Virginia, and I was born in the Morris Room.
So, after you were born, how long did you stay there before you went back home?
Well, that was our home. That was our home for almost 2 years. One of my earliest childhood memories is the fact that at Christmas time, it was before I started to school. My mother taught me how to read some and how to write some, and of course we didn't have much money for anything except the bare necessities. And I got a pencil tablet and a little brown pencil, and I wanted to spell God is love. That was one of my first memories. Maybe my first one. Very close to that. Of course, we moved to different houses, but that were available at the time, where my dad could have a garden, have a cow, and so on. And I remember my baby sister being maybe 2 or 3 weeks old, and we were getting ready to go to church. It was in the summertime, springtime, and my mother had her wrapped up with a blanket, and the blanket over her head. And I told my mother, she can't breathe. But my mother assured me that she could still breathe, but I was afraid she was not going to be able to breathe.
And what were your sisters' names?
Ruth, Alma, and Anna Lee. And Alma would not let us call her Alma. She was called Betty. She nicknamed herself, and my sisters had a little more spunk than I did. They would let Daddy and Mother know what they wanted, and they got by with a lot more than I did in my younger years. And my middle sister liked the story about Betty Lou lost her shoe. And every time Mother and Daddy would call her Alma, she'd say, "My name is not Alma, it is Betty." And so they called her Betty.
So her given name didn't matter.
Didn't
It was
matter.
just yours.
Well, it wasn't, right. It wasn't, to them, Betty wasn't a nickname for her. She had renamed herself, and the only difference was it wasn't on her birth certificate.
Interesting. Alma, her middle name was Luetta, wasn't it?
Yes, I believe that's right, Alma Luetta.
Named after?
Ruth, Alma Luetta, and Anna Lee.
So Alma Luetta, or was it Ruth Luetta? No, that's what you named your
That's what
first
we
one.
named our girl.
What was your favorite toy when you were growing up?
It's strange. I do not remember. I know I must have had toys. We didn't have very many toys. And I guess I always wanted a Shirley Temple doll. And of course, because it was a Shirley Temple doll, I would never have been allowed to they would never have bought me one. Now, I might have been allowed to keep it if it had been given to me. But after my sisters died, we went to Ohio to a yearly meeting that had been paid for, especially through Herbert Handy and his wife. And we had some gifts given to us, and I remember a beautiful doll being given to me. Now, I don't remember playing with her a lot. I was 8 years old. I don't remember playing with her a lot. I have no idea what happened to her and why I don't remember playing with her. But that's just about the only really toy, except that I did want a ball to bounce. And I'm talking about just a little rubber ball that was pretty, and I wanted a ball to bounce, and they got me a ball for Christmas one year.
Interesting. Thinking about grandmother and granddaddy, and your sisters. Of course, your sisters were quite a bit younger than you, or the younger two were.
Yeah.
What were their personalities like? Starting with your mother and father.
Starting with my mother and father, my middle sister that died, Alma, Betty, had one time said she wanted Jesus to come into her heart, and Mother said that we prayed, they prayed, and she said Jesus had come into her heart. And so Mother often spoke about the fact that she had become a Christian at 3 years of age. Now my sister, just younger than me, I understand was a very stubborn little girl. My mother said that she was determined to have her own way, and before she could even speak, she'd raise her hand to slap Mother and Daddy when they didn't do what she wanted. So, and the baby was, they said, the only thing I remember particularly about them talking about her was she was 22 months old when she died. And of course, to get water, you had to go to the well and pump you. And sometimes you had to prime the pump to go get the water. And she was standing out by the pump one day and just had been learning how to talk, express herself, and it started raining, and she said, "It's painting outdoors, it's painting outdoors."
Do you remember playing with your sisters very much?
Not very much, but we moved to one house, and we liked to make mud pies. You know, that was really something. You'd build your little house outside with twigs, and you'd clean off a place, and then you'd get some water and make some mud pies and fix your little rooms and so on. And I remember one time my sister and I were playing in the mud, and we had our hands all muddy, and we knew we better not open the screen door. So I remember standing at the door, holding up our little muddy fingers, asking our mother to let us come in. And I'm sure she washed our hands outside, but I don't remember that part of it. I just remember we had muddy fingers after playing with the mud pies.
And that was in Craigsville?
Well, that was when we lived back in, we never actually lived in Craigsville. That was the little town we went to. It was back in Esteline Valley.
Okay, okay, that's right. At the house that you've given me a picture of.
No, that wasn't the house. That was before we moved at that. See, we had moved at that house not too terribly long before my sisters died. Now, I do remember one thing, that they would give us an old catalog, and when we didn't need to use it at the outhouse, they'd give us some pages, and we were learning how to cut out pictures. So we would cut out, and that is the one thing I remember us doing, cutting out pictures from an old Montgomery Ward catalog.
So you actually used those things for the outhouse too?
Oh, that was all we had to use for the outhouse.
And
we used the soft pages, and we crumpled them together to make them softer.
So, for my granddaughters who have no clue what an outhouse is, what was the outhouse?
The outhouse was a path back to a little building, and you went inside and closed the door, and there were usually two holes, and you got to sit on whichever hole you decided you wanted to sit on. In the wintertime it was awful cold, in the summertime there's spiders, and when we were getting ready to move to the house where we had our fingers all muddy and dirty, we were getting ready to move there, and we need to go to the bathroom. And if we ever needed to go, we were never allowed to say anything but just say we needed attention. So we needed some attention, and they let us go to the outhouse, and there was one hole that had a spider web over it. My sister said she wasn't going to sit there, so we came back up and told my daddy that there was a spider web over one of the holes. He went down to clean the spider web off, looked down in there, it was a rattlesnake coiled,
Oh
ready
my
to
goodness.
strike. So the Lord let the spider web be there to protect my sister.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever heard that story before.
That was, we lived in the country of rattlesnakes, mountain rattlers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Did you have, this question on this paper says family chores, but did you have your own chores that you had to do all the time? Was there something that you specifically had to do?
I don't remember that there was anything specifically that I had to do, except I would have to wash dishes sometimes, and when Daddy and Mother had saved up enough and had some money given to them, and they built a house, and when it was just the shell of a house, we were able to move into it, because the yearly meeting had helped with some land, and they had been able to buy some land. And so when I say a shell of a house, it was a shell of a house. It had the outside walls and some very crude stairs to the two bedrooms, three, with a hall bedroom and the bedroom upstairs. And and as they were able to do it, they finished the inside of the rooms. So it was done one at a time. And until that was done, and I was about 10 years old at that time, I had a dust broom, little dust brush, and a little dust pan. And that was my job to, at least once a week, to go through the house and dust off what we call the cross pieces until the finished wall could be put up on the inside.
Huh.
And the nights were very cold that winter. There was nothing to keep the wind out except the boards from the outside, and there were windows in the house.
No insulation or anything.
Oh no, and not even no insulation when they got the inside wall put up. That was the only insulation we had.
Mm. What kind of heat did you have? Was it a fireplace or a wood stove?
Wood stove.
And you probably cooked on that too and everything.
Well, they had a wood stove in the dining room, and I think when they used the living room, they opened the living room door to get some heat in that, and they had a little old wood stove that they used out in the kitchen, and got our water by pumping it out in the backyard. My dad and some people, I remember a couple of men would dug the well, and they'd dig it, and then they'd set off dynamite and blast some rocks out, and then go down and clean that out and dig some more and blast some more until we got some water. But they did have water before we moved in.
And that was the place in Augusta County?
right down from the in Esteline Valley.
Right.
Right after it was the house we lived in after my sisters died.
And that would have been in the 30s,
Oh yeah, yeah.
1930s sometime.
Uh-huh. 30. I think we moved in there. He was working on the church in 33, and they finished the shell of the church, and then he started on the house. So 35, 34, 35.
Didn't Granddaddy build a church there
Yes.
too?
Yeah.
Is
yeah,
that where he
was,
built the?
He was building the church when my sisters died.
Oh, okay. Now
Yeah.
tell me about that. Tell me when your sisters died. They all three died within how many days of each other?
9 days.
9 days.
We lived on the farm up above Augusta Springs. That was the place where we lived in this house that was over 100 years old and hadn't anybody lived in a long time. A wealthy man from New York City had property. In fact, he owned the farm, and his brother had a store in Craigsville. So the two brothers, we don't know how they found that area of Virginia, but they liked it, and one became a merchant, and the other one had bought the farm. So there were. He had a caretaker, a full-time caretaker named Pat, and I forget, Bill Montgomery, I think it was. And they didn't have any children, but they were a very sweet couple. And Daddy helped them do the farm work, and that was very interesting. They had 2 huge barns on the farm, and lots of cattle, and they grew wheat and corn and raised sheep, and we had at one time there we had 2 cows, but most of the time it was just the one cow that we had. Had some chickens and pigs. And that's when for my sisters, it was they had built a new part to the house, which we called the new part, and it was sort of what they called a parlor back then. And downstairs was 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, living, dining room area. And upstairs you went through up some little dark steps to sort of a loft-like type of room. Not really very tall, and that was my bedroom upstairs.
Hmm.
My
So-
sisters.
What did your sisters get, illness-wise, that caused their death? And was it an extreme? It was during the winter when they died, wasn't it?
Right. I had been sick. They didn't know what was wrong with me, and Mother was very slow to go to the doctor because we had to go 20-some miles to go to one. But they prayed for me, and I started to get a little better, and then my sister got sick. My oldest sister got sick, and they knew she was pretty bad off, so they didn't have telephone. Daddy walked across up the lane and over to where the Montgomerys lived on the farm and asked them to call, and so our family doctor came out. They thought it was I forget what kind of strep. They didn't think it was strep throat. I think they didn't know anything about it. It was something. First, they thought it was diphtheria, and it wasn't diphtheria. They called in the county health department. He didn't know what it was, and they wanted to take her to the hospital, and Mother said no. She wasn't going to let her daughter go to the hospital. And they called in the county. There were 3 doctors, our family doctor, eye, ear, and nose, throat, and then the county health department doctor. And Mother said she knew there wasn't any they wouldn't be able to help her for some reason, and she said, no, I'm going to take care of her here at home. And she died the next day.
And that was
So-
which one?
Ruth.
Ruth, the next one under you.
Yeah. And it was so contagious, and they didn't know what it was. So they tacked a notice to the outside of the house, well, our porch, by the door and our porch, and nobody was allowed inside the house. And they had a graveside service the next day. She died on Saturday. They had a graveside service on Sunday. The third, in the meantime, my baby sister got sick. And she was sick one day, and she died the next day.
Within one day.
Yes.
Oh my.
And so they had a graveside service for her. And Daddy was the only one that was able to go to her because they would not allow any service inside or out, anywhere around except at the grave. So they were just not sure what was going on. They had no idea. Trench mouth, they thought it might be trench mouth. They thought it might be diphtheria. No, it wasn't diphtheria. They didn't know what it was, but their throats would swell. So everybody seemed to, Daddy had been sick too, whether he had the same thing, whether I had the same thing before they got it, but we both had been sick. And they decided, since nobody was sick now, after my sisters had both died, that they did what they call fumigated the house.
So did you have to leave when they did that?
We had to go outside, but we didn't go spend a night that I recall. They worked at it during the day, and I forget what, I just don't remember except that they did it. And Mother said my middle sister, Alma, but she called herself Betty, she said she went upstairs and she was jumping, and she said, "You've got 2 little girlies in heaven and 2 little girlies down here now." And they thought everything was fine. And she got sick, and I don't know, about 2 or 3 days, I'm not sure how, but anyway, it didn't take her long. They called the doctors back in, and Mother Morris had a clinic at the time, and she had 2 nurses that was working with her, and one of them was from Connecticut. And actually, a sister of one of the nurses died out in Oregon at the home out there, the Friends home. She and her sister became, I don't know what kind of work they did, but they worked in the year of the meeting. And she died a few years ago back out in Oregon in the home out there. But the other nurse came over and she said, "I want to volunteer my time." She walked in the room where my sister was. She looked at the doctor and she said, "She has strep throat." And the doctor said, "Well, he didn't know." She said, "It is strep throat." And she had worked on a case where a person had had severe strep infection in Connecticut a few years before she came down. Well, they did a biopsy, sent it off, and it took 20-some days to get the report back. My sister was dead by then. My dad had to hold her while she choked because she couldn't breathe, or she just swelled shut. And the report came back and said there were 21 different strains, or whatever you call it, of the strep virus. And theirs was the most severe of any strain that was known. And where they got it, we never know. We have never known. My mother says they got it from a cat. She said, we like to play with cats and dogs, and a stray cat came up and it was sick. and one of my sisters was out playing with it before she got her away from the cat. And Mother always declared the cat brought it. But there was not another case in the whole county, and as far as what they knew, not another case in the whole area of the state that had that particular type of strep.
Mm. I know there was an article that you gave to me telling about that. Didn't you, before I stop and take a little break, because my arm's giving out, didn't you also say that one of them, and I think it was your baby sister, died in Granddaddy's arms?
That was the middle one.
That was
Betty.
Alma then,
That was
Betty.
Alma.
Betty, yeah. So he was holding her, and
He was
she just,
holding her when she died.
she breathed her last right in his arms.
Yeah,
Mm. That had to have been hard for him, too.
it was. It was very hard.
Mm. What do you remember about your grandparents? Who were they, both sides, and anything that you remember about either one of them?
I remember very little about any of my grandparents. My mother's mother died when I was about 2 years old, and I'm pretty sure that this was a vague recollection of the time she died, because I can remember being in a hallway and a lot of people going in and out, which is a very rare thing to remember about my Grandpa Mason's home. They had a parlor, and of course the parlor door was closed at all times unless there was some special event going on. And we would go down the hall into their dining living room area, which was always really nice and pretty. But that must have been the time when my grandmother Mason died. My grandpa Mason lived in the home, and when we would go down there, he'd have a little brown bag with little white peppermint candies. So I always knew I'd get a little piece of peppermint candy. But the one thing I didn't understand was coming out on the front porch. We would spend maybe a couple nights there when we did get to go down to see them when we lived in the mountains, which is where we lived when he was living. And he would take something brown out of his pocket and his knife and cut him a little piece and put it in his mouth and put that brown something back in his pocket. And I can remember sitting on the steps and thinking, I wonder why Granddaddy doesn't give me a piece of that, because he always brought me a piece of candy and let me have candy. You know, and I never asked. I was very quiet, and I had been taught, you don't do a lot of asking questions, and so I just watched, and in later years learned that he was chewing his tobacco.
So he wouldn't give you a piece of his chewing tobacco.
No, he wouldn't give me a piece of his chewing tobacco. And one time after my
And that was in Newport News?
Yeah, in Newport News, 2610 Orchid Avenue. And the one time I remember him coming up, and I think one of my uncles must have brought him up for us, and Mother and Daddy wanted him to stay two or three days, and he would sit out under the shade tree. I have no idea. I think he slept in what we called that little guest room, which was the nicest little bedroom in the old house we lived in. But I had this little lamb that the mother had refused. When there are twins, the mother refuses one. And so Mr. Montgomery had told my dad that if he wanted it, or if they wanted to give it to me, that I could have it. Well, of course, I had no pet, and that was wonderful. And Daddy and Mother said, "Now you're going to have to feed the lamb and help take care of it." Well, I was happy to do that. We had a cow, and so I would hold the bottle while the lamb uh, learned to eat, and I don't remember. I don't remember what happened when he was too big to get the bottle, but anyway, he was a very good buddy of mine, and I named him Roscoe.
Hmm.
And he would run and play, and just became quite a pet. And when my grandpa was sitting out under the shade tree, he'd come over to my grandpa's and want to play with him. And my grandpa wasn't mean to him, but he'd just kind of kick his foot and say, "Go on, Rosso, go on, go on, Rosso, go on." So Rosso never got to play with my grandpa.
Huh.
But then, of course, I couldn't keep a pet. To be a pet, I had to sell him. And when they were selling the sheep and the lambs, the truck came, and Daddy told me I was going to have to sell Roscoe, because we couldn't afford to just feed Roscoe and just have him for a pet. So I got $5 for him, and I have no real recollection of what happened to my $5, except I'm sure it went to buy me some clothes.
Huh.
So
So it was either, a pet was either food or money to buy what you needed.
exactly. So that was the story of my pet lamb. Well, then when right after my sisters died, we were given a trip to a yearly meeting, and then we're able to go over and see my grandmother Berger. My grandfather Berger had died 2 years before my dad and mother were married, so I never got to see him. And my grandmother Berger died on my 13th birthday, so she was 78 years old, or 75. I'm not sure which, 75 or 78 when she died.
And her name was?
Was Elizabeth Geiger Berger.
Who you were named after.
Right. And at the time, she was in her 60s when we went up there. But I don't remember her saying anything to me. I don't remember her ignoring me. I don't remember her welcoming me. I remember my Uncle Dan and my Aunt Louetta. Oh, they were just, they paid a lot of attention to me. And my dear old grandmother was in her 60s, so she was really an old woman, I thought. And I think she acted like an old woman too, because when you got up close to 70 back then, you were considered quite elderly. So
And just for the record, how old are you now?
I am 87 years old and will be 87 years and 8 months in just on September the 3rd. So I've only got a few days that will be before I'm 8 months past my 87th birthday.
So if your grandmother Berger was old in her 60s,
I'm ancient.
but you don't act ancient.
No, I don't feel ancient sometimes. Sometimes I do.
Well, thank the Lord, so far you're in pretty good health for 87.
Oh, definitely. So that's the story of my grandparents.
So you wouldn't have, since your grandfather died before your parents were married,
Right.
you obviously wouldn't have remembered anything. Do you remember any stories about him?
Except that he liked to hunt, and hunting was more than just a hobby. It was a way of getting food, and I remember my dad saying one day his dad came in and sat and cried because he didn't find anything to get that day he went hunting.
Because he couldn't feed his family.
Right.
And this would have been in St. Mary's, Ohio, or before they moved to St. Mary's?
I would say it would be in the vicinity of St. Mary's. I don't know that they lived right in town at that time, because they had lived out in the country.
Didn't they move to St. Mary's and all of them worked in a chain factory
in a
or
chain
something?
factory, exactly, yes.
Hmm.
Yes, and the ones that didn't work in the chain factory there, 2 or 3 of them moved to Mansfield, Ohio, and I don't know whether it was whether there was a chain factory there to begin with or not, but they worked in the Maytag as I understand it, the Maytag company.
Oh, okay.
I believe it was Maytag. It was one of the companies that made appliances.
And that would have been back when they were those old ringer washer Maytags
Oh,
with
yes.
with
And
the
I
gas
think
motor on it or
the
something?
gas motor, and I think the company also made one of the companies I think made some refrigerators. So there were a couple of companies. Mansfield was a very progressive uh, city. St. Mary's became a little bit more so because Aunt Louetta worked in the blanket factory there.
Oh,
Made
in the
blankets.
blanket factory, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. Didn't she became a nurse later on? Didn't
She
she? Or
actually, she and Aunt Thelma did not take nurses training, except they were considered uh, nursing assistants.
okay.
And back in those days, you didn't have to go to, you didn't have to have as much education in the medical field as you do now, but they were both nursing assistants.
Hmm. And Thelma being her older sister.
Yes,
Okay. Granddaddy's sisters.
right.
Okay. Excuse me. Let's see. Trying to think if there might be something else you could tell me about then in that area.
Well, when we went up there, and I was 8 years old, we had, Mother and Daddy, of course, had some financial assistance so we could go up there. And that was a most wonderful trip. And Daddy had some cousins that we were going to go eat lunch with them. And I guess it probably took a couple of cars, I don't remember, but I forget their names, and they had a nice big house, and the lunch was absolutely wonderful. And for dessert, they had cookies. The base was sort of like a vanilla wafer, only a little bigger, a marshmallow top, and it was pink, and it had coconut. It was drizzled with coconut. Well, I thought those were the best cookies I had ever eaten in my life, and I of course I didn't need to ask for another one, and when they asked if I'd like to have another one, I did, and of course my mother wanted me to be a lady and be careful and not overdo, and they said that's all right, she can have some more. So I ate 2 or 3 of those cookies, and I thought they were the best cookies I ever ate in my life. I'd never had anything like that. And then we were walking outside, and I had gotten a new coat, which was very rare. I wore hand-me-downs most of the time. And I don't remember where the coat came from. I mean, I know Mother and Daddy got it, but I don't remember what store or anything, and it was a lightweight. And we were walking along, and as I was taking a step forward, my daddy's cousin went to spit tobacco, and he hit my new coat right smack in front.
Oh no.
Oh, he was so embarrassed. He couldn't apologize enough, and they worked. I guess they got the stain out. I don't remember. He couldn't work enough. He couldn't apologize enough. So I got a bag of candy out of it.
Oh my goodness.
I can't
What?
remember what kind, but
Was that a
they
good
gave
trade?
Uh,
Was that a good trade?
I thought it was pretty nice to get a bag of candy.
Do you remember which uncle it was?
No, it was my daddy's cousin.
Oh,
It
okay.
wasn't an uncle, it was a cousin.
Oh,
And
okay.
we talked about that for years when cousin, I forget his name, spit tobacco juice on my new coat. And my mother did reach the place she could laugh about it, so that was good.
I'm glad to hear that because grandmother liked to laugh sometimes.
Yeah, she liked to laugh sometimes, and sometimes she didn't. So
Yeah.
that was good.
Well, let's go to come back home from yearly meeting and from visiting the burgers in Ohio to Esteline Valley. After that, Granddaddy moved to where was it, and why did he move?
From Esteline Valley,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I was becoming a teenager, and he had gotten acquainted with some people in Greensboro area, Pomona, North Carolina, and they needed a pastor there. And I think they thought it would be a better thing for me to, if they could get me out more into society, not into society necessarily, but to meet more people than just the mountain people. So they moved to Pomona, and he became pastor of Pomona Friends Church when I was 13.
And Pomona is,
Now
In-
Hunter Hills.
which is in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Right, and all of Pomona is part of Greensboro.
So, where did you go to school while you were there?
Private schools and Christian schools were almost unheard of, but they did not want me where there was any worldly influence, and there was one of the, it is now Laurel University, formerly John Wesley College, and when I went there it was Jim Green's Bible School. They had grade school, high school, and a general Bible school, which would be similar to a seminary for young men who were training to be pastors. So one of the ladies from our church drove over. She taught public speaking and I forget what else, and her two children went there. So Daddy and Mother paid her to take me about 5 miles over to Greensboro area where the school was on High Point Road. It was on High Point Road, and I went there, but I was always disappointed because I wanted to take home ec in school, and all they had to offer was college entrance courses. And of course, I had my algebra, my history, my English, all of the things that you would have to have for college entrance, but I never got to take home ec. And I was very disappointed that I didn't, but I don't think I told them that. Whether I ever told them, I don't know.
Well, I think you did pretty well, though. Even though you didn't get to take home ec, you made dresses for your daughters.
That's right.
And you made cookies that everybody in Mayfield Heights, Ohio, wanted to come and see and eat.
Yeah, so I did make
So-
that. I did learn how to do a lot of things, so so it turned out all right.
Yep. Okay. Now, while you were in Greensboro and your dad was pastor at Pomona Friends Church, which is now Hunter Hills, there was a young man who came to your church or something. How did you meet Daddy? What
Well,
what was that?
My daddy met your daddy. He had gone to school, high school, with some of them from our church, especially Bill Atchison. And your dad had become a Christian, and actually had changed from the Moravian Church to the Nazarene Church. But he was actually, in his heart, he was a conscientious objector, and he knew friends were conscientious objectors. They were not they were opposed to the war and fighting and so on. So he and Bill were good friends, and Bill had him come out to the church some. So I remember Daddy telling about this young man came out there, and he got acquainted with him, and then your dad still had to go in service because the Nazarenes did, and he didn't have any. He was not in seminary, so he still had to go in, and he worked in medical records, but he never was really happy as far as that goes about that. But anyway, he went in, and then after he got out of service, he had joined the Friends Church out in Colorado Springs, and he was pastor of a little church before he went into service, and he kept requesting the fact that he was a conscientious objector, and he would like to be sent out of service. Well, they finally considered his reasons and gave him an honorable discharge in 43. So he started coming to church out Pomona, and we got acquainted, but he was quiet and kind of shy, and I don't think he was too interested in girls. He was more interested in preaching. And he had been going to the Friends Church out in Colorado, and he had a lot of friends out there, and the little church in Fort Collins needed a pastor, so they asked him to come out there to pastor the church, and he went. And he wrote Daddy a few times, and he was kind of hinting he wanted somebody else to write to him and other people to write to him. So Daddy said, well, he'd like to have some people write to him. Said, do you want to write to him? I said, oh, all right. I wrote him a letter. Well, he didn't write Daddy anymore. He wrote me.
So you took precedence over Granddaddy.
Yeah, I took precedence over your granddaddy.
That's interesting. So what kind of things, don't give away all your secrets, but what kind of things did Daddy write to you when he wrote?
Mainly about the church and what he was doing, and about the attendance and what kind of activities they had, or something like that.
And then he did actually write Granddaddy again, didn't he?
No, he told
Or did he
me.
write you?
He
And
wrote,
this is the infamous letter, right?
yeah, this is the infamous letter. He wrote me, and well, what had happened out there, they told him he needed a wife because the girls were trying to get his attention, and the superintendent said, Gaither, you need a wife. Well, he thought that'd be a pretty good idea too. So he told me he loved me and he'd like for us to get married, and what if it was all right with my dad and mother, find out from them if it was all right. So he didn't write the letter. I had to ask Daddy.
You're kidding. I had not heard that one before.
Yeah.
Okay, now, so the letters must have been pretty juicy that you wrote back to him for him to say he loved you and wanted you to marry him.
Yeah, it was just not a whole lot. I was just sort of businesslike was all it was. He needed a wife, and it wasn't anything very romantic.
So he just needed a wife.
Yeah, it wasn't romantic at all. Except he said he loved me, so that was about the romance it was. Then when I said, well, yes, Daddy said, now are you sure? And I said, well, yeah, I felt sure. And so then he wanted to get married real quick. And Daddy and Mother were moving to Pleasant View, and I wanted time to get, plan a wedding and do a lot of things, and I wanted a pretty white dress, and my mother wouldn't let me have a white dress, and that hurt my feelings, and they decided I should get married while we were at Pomona because that's where my friends were, and his family was. So they said, well, I need to get married. We need to get married before winter because winters were hard out there. So I said, all right, you know, they made all the plans, so I just went along with it. And Mother said, no, you get married in blue. I said, well, I'd like to have a pretty white dress. Mother said, you get married in blue. If you're married in blue, you'll always be true. If you're married in red, you'll wish you were dead. If you were married in black, you'll wish you were back. And said, you need to get married in blue. That's what I got married in, and I want you. And so she went with me to pick out a blue dress.
You told me that story before, but you never told me that she got married in blue, and that's the way she wanted you to do.
She wanted,
That's interesting.
oh, yes.
If you're married in blue, you'll always be true.
Yeah. Married in black, you wish you were black. Married in red, you wish you were dead. And I forget what there was one other thing. My mother was pretty determined that I was going to do the way she had it planned. So all right, you know, if that has to be, it has to be. So I went along with it. Now, according to what she said about my sister before she died, my sister said she was very determined, and I've thought since, yeah, maybe the Lord knew that my sisters wouldn't have said yes nearly as quick as I would have to Daddy and Mother.
And even if the proposal was a letter, and that it was quite businesslike, if you want to call
Yeah.
it that, how many years did it last?
56 years, almost 57.
Till death us do part.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is for sure. Let's see, there was something else. Oh, I was going to tell you about that, but I forget now what that. Oh, naturally, your daddy's family was shocked, and it took them a few years before they ever accepted me. And your Aunt Lois was very bitter about us being married, and she just made fun of me one time on the city bus. We rode the city bus because I was working downtown by that time. And when she got on that bus one morning, and I happened to be on there, oh, it hurt my feelings so bad. She walked back past me. She spoke, barely spoke, and walked past me and sat down beside one of her girlfriends and just ha-ha'd at me. She's the one she's going to be my sister-in-law one of these days. And she just thought that was so, but she changed her tune later on. And
So-
she finally decided I was all right.
And who was the relative that took care of Aunt Lois when she was
Yeah.
getting old?
Yeah, who was it? It was me and our family.
And your oldest son took care of her just about till the day she died.
He did. He was, in fact, he was the one they called when they said if you want to see her, and so he was the last one saw her alive.
Mm.
Yep.
But good thing
And
she...
the whole family, I mean, the whole Reich family has depended. We had the reunions. It was up to, we had them, and now the cousins all, they keep in touch with me to keep up the information. But it was Lois that she was really bitter. They wanted him to marry Dorothy Haywood. And he told me, he said, well, Dorothy was a good girl, but he said he didn't want to marry her. She wasn't, I mean, he wasn't in love with Dorothy, but she was, they had a girl picked out for him, and
She wasn't 56 years worth.
No, she wasn't 56 years old.
Well, I for one am glad you said yes.
Well, I've never regretted it. I've never regretted it. I'd do it all over again.
Before I take another break, what kind of man was your husband?
My husband was a quiet man. He was a very strong, determined man in his own quiet way, but he knew what he wanted. He knew what he had planned, what he planned to do. He had his ideals. He had his whatever it was. If he said no, that was no. If he said yes, okay, that was all right. But he always had his plans and did what, just the way he wanted things done.
Was he gentle?
Oh, very gentle. Oh, yes, a very, very gentle person. He didn't express himself in a lot of ways as far as loving ways. I mean, but he was very gentle. He was one thing he was determined to do, and that was he was determined that he was going to see to it that he and I were taken care of in our old age without having to depend on his children. Because his dad was not a good money handler. His mother didn't have anything to handle because his dad was not, he just didn't let her have anything to handle, really. But he was determined that we had to do without. That's all right. We had food on the table, the bills were paid, and we had clothes to wear, and he was saving for our old age. And he was determined that we were not going to depend on our children to take care of us when we were older.
And did that work out?
Very well. There was many a time I think, oh, this would make it so much easier if we could just get this. But if we could do without it, we did without it. So we could put some back to save, to take care of us. He just didn't. He and his brothers and sister had a total expense of taking care of his mom, their mom and their dad. And not a one of them complained. Not a single one complained. And Evelyn would tell me every once in a while, she said, you know, I'm so proud of the family. When Mother Reich died, they all met. They depended on your dad to take care of the business part of it. But they put down how much this cost, how much that cost, how much something else cost. They divided it 5 ways. Every single one of them paid their way. When Pop died, the same thing happened. They all met. They met. There wasn't an argument. There wasn't a complaint. They all put their money. They gave their money. And so, but he said he did not want that to happen when we died. He wanted us to be taken care of and not have to, when we'd go to see them, we'd buy food and help them out because they were in just real bad shape. And he said he wasn't going to allow that to happen. So he let up a little bit in a little later years. He let us have things that were a little more convenient and comfortable. But he said he was taking care of us so that we would have something to eat, we'd have a place to live, and we'd have money to bury us.
I do remember that towards the end he really liked his new cars.
Oh, he did.
Finally, after all those years.
He was 75 before he bought a new car. I mean, we would start out in cars that were really dangerous, but he wouldn't even consider getting a car that was new or almost new. until he got older. And he said, I can't work on a car now. He said, I have to, I'm just not able to do it. And the newer cars you can't work on. And he said, I don't want us to be caught out on the highway with car trouble. So he did. He was able to, that was one thing he enjoyed when he got older.
And good for him. But I do remember at Saxbahaw frequently, whatever car we had, it was frequently up on a jack.
Oh,
Either the brakes being changed or bled or something being fixed on it,
goodness.
and he always kept them running.
he kept them running. And the church was first. I could be in bed sick, and he'd say, "Well, how are you doing?" And if you're all right now, I'm going to go over. The church needs painting. I'm painting. I need to do one of the Sunday school rooms. Didn't matter what, as long as I was breathing and eating, he'd go over. A church needed painting. The church needed something done to it. He'd do it. He knew he felt like I was strong. I could handle it, so he'd just check on me and go over and do whatever he needed to do. Somebody was sick at the church, at the hospital. He needed to be there at night. He'd be there. Daytime, he'd be there.
Well, I guess he thought if you could single-handedly take down the woods next to the house,
Yeah, that's right.
that you probably could take care of yourself.
Yeah, I think, oh yes, I'm sure he did.
You remember that?
I remember that. Yeah, I remember chopping down those trees and
Elizabeth out there with an axe,
Oh, yeah.
taking down all those trees.
Pulling down poison oak and getting poison oak and pulling down vines and
It's probably a good thing you did that, so it exposed the fence, because you remember one day we ate some pizza or something that
yeah.
Betty opened a can.
squirted the ceiling.
So what did we end up doing?
Yeah, I fed you up a cat and sent you all out to the fence
Until
until you threw it up so you wouldn't die.
we're still here,
And you're still here.
and so are you.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
but that was he had lived a hard life. Now he worked. He and Lois were the only ones that ever finished high school until I guess Ben apparently whatever he did, he ended up with a good job there at the but he didn't finish high school before he went in service. But he was determined he was going to school, finish school. And his dad would move and he'd be put back. So he was 19 when he finished high school.
Hmm.
And he finished. And
That
Lois
was in Greensboro.
in Greensboro, exactly. And the year he died, he got the only notice of a class reunion that he ever got in his whole life.
Really?
Uh-huh. And so they said if you have any information or you're still living or whatever, send any information. So I sent a picture of him, our family picture, I think, and a little bit of the history. But you know how old because he was 81 then.
Right.
And but he did. He was determined that he was going to finish, and he did finish. But I've always really resented the fact. Now, I don't mean that I've held it, that I haven't forgiven them. It's not that part, but I just thought it was so unfair. His mother never had anything except just what little bit Pop would make, and he would let her get some groceries, but she couldn't get, and that's about all, and a few clothes. And she would bake, and he would take the things that she baked and sell them and keep the money that she had spent to bake, maybe cakes or pies or something. So when your daddy went to work, they kept all his money. And when he was 20 years old,
So Daddy didn't get to keep his checks,
uh-uh, oh
even
no,
when he worked at the Glasscock.
uh-uh.
Mm.
And he asked them after he was saved if he could have his tithe, and they didn't want to give him that, but they finally did. But if he needed something, they thought he needed something, they would buy it for him. And when he was 20 years old, his dad said, well, he needs to be able to have his own money and pay board. And he would, his mother didn't want him to, because that was the only way she had to pay. She had bought her a washer, bless her heart, she needed a washer,
Mm.
and a little refrigerator, and the only way she could pay for them was when the children would help her. And I think then Lois did help then later, but they kept your daddy's money till he was 20 years old,
Wow.
every bit of it, except his tithe. And I've always thought that wasn't right. But then his mother she wasn't doing it to be mean, she was doing it just to exist.
Mhm.
Just exist. But Pop would decide he wanted to buy something, and he bought a piano and couldn't pay for it, and so it went back. And
Why would Granddaddy buy a piano if neither one of them played?
it was just his idea. He thought it would be something fancy, I think, and then they'd run out of groceries, and I'm sure Lois was right. She said she paid more than one bill up to the little grocery store close by.
Mm-hmm.
Your grandma would have to have something to eat, and she'd get a little something for food, and he'd run up bills and wouldn't pay them.
I'm going to ask you another question, and I don't mean this to be judgmental of Granddaddy Wright, because I love Granddaddy, whom you've been calling Pop.
Yeah, well, that's what we all called him, Pop.
I mean, I have good memories of him. Not
Uh-huh.
a ton of them, but a lot of good memories
Oh,
of
yes.
him. But I do know one thing, that he smoked.
Oh, definitely.
And did he smoke, and was that part of the money that Daddy and everybody else gave him whenever times were tough for them?
Well,
Or did he not smoke
he
during
al-
that time?
It may have been. Now he worked when they were working. He worked at the factory. I mean,
Right.
the glass cock stove factory.
I think at least 2 or 3 of them worked there.
Yeah. So I don't know whether that was part. I don't think the money that they gave. I think that went to her paying her bills, like helping pay for the washer and the refrigerator. And I mean the old-fashioned washer and a little old refrigerator. Not you know what I mean by old. I mean
Yeah.
nothing fancy.
Hmm.
But I think that was where their money went mostly, was to help her.
Yeah.